From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Sandy Johnson will advise you cattle producers on testing your sorghum and sudan, hay, and grazing forages for high nitrate and prussic acid levels. She's been studying the occurrence of these toxins and talks about managing to avoid cattle losses, including the appropriate forage sampling procedure. Also today, from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen is back, this time to discuss the protection of farm or ranch assets from creditors. That would include a liability ruling against a producer. He tells us of a recent case where that was handled exactly the wrong way. And standing by with another Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven, and more here on Agriculture Today. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We appreciate you tuning in on this Wednesday. First off today, for you cattle producers, we're going to address what is a potential issue every fall, it seems. And our guest now is actually looking into more of the particulars of nitrate and prussic acid poisoning of cattle due to some feedstuff problems. Joining us once again is Sandy Johnson, Beef Systems Specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Sandy, of course, is based in northwest Kansas. When we look at these harvested forages as well as, in some cases, standing forages, Sandy, there are these threats out there, and they're not to be taken lightly, are they?
Right. It's, one of the forages we like a lot is things in the sorghum family, whether it's forage sorghum or sorghum sudan crosses. Plants in that family have a propensity to accumulate nitrates as well as have high prussic acid content. And so we need to be, while that makes a great feedstuff for us, we need to be aware of those challenges. And there's ways that we can minimize risk. And I guess that's what we want to talk about more.
You bet. But before we do that, let's distinguish between nitrate toxicity and prussic acid poisoning. The end results are never good in either case, but they are different elements, aren't they?
Right. So nitrate poisoning comes from, the plant is going to try and take up nitrogen and use it to grow the rest of the plant. Okay, so it's pulling that out of the soil, and if you think about essentially the growing conditions inhibiting that process, whether it's from lack of moisture or nutrients, or maybe hail causes all the leaves to be damaged and it can't do photosynthesis. Any type of stressor like that is going to cause that to remain in the base of the plant. And if there's a lot of stress in the right conditions, it can actually be throughout the plant. And so the nitrates concentrate in the bottom. Usually the leaves are not a problem. Now we contrast that with prussic acid. Now in a lot of plants, they have a compound within the plant called durin, and when certain conditions exist that allow the durin to interact with an enzyme that's over here in another cell or part of the cell, when the enzyme gets with the durin, it's converted to cyanide. So, as you know, cyanide is quite poisonous. This is a plant-protected mechanism, but can obviously be dangerous for their cattle. And the parts of the plant that tend to have the highest concentration of prussic acid are the new growth, and so the youngest leaves. And we typically think of that being a biggest problem with regrowth that might occur. Say we could be from plant, it all hailed out and there was regrowth, or perhaps you had a sorghum sudan, you took a first cutting and there was a second cutting available, may or may not get very far, but it's that youngest part of the plant that could be very problematic. So depending on how we're going to use those various forages, we need to understand that difference and do our management accordingly. And the challenge with both of these is that we know there are a variety of interactions of management factors that cause them to be problematic, and it's extremely difficult to identify all of those and all the interactions that might come about.
But there are precautions, as you're saying, that producers can take in their management. Before we get to those, do cattle respond differently to high nitrates as opposed to prussic acid?
Well, so both of these toxicities end up impacting oxygen transportation in the animal. So in the case of nitrates, what happens is the high nitrates result in the inability, well, hemoglobin is converted into methemoglobin, which can't carry oxygen. Okay, so we think of if we were there right at the time the animal's dying, that blood would look brownish, chocolatey, because there's not any oxygen in it. Conversely, the prussic acid, the hemoglobin can still carry the oxygen, but it can't leave the hemoglobin to be available to the cell. So in that case, the blood is bright cherry red. And, with the prussic acid, usually death can be very rapid. And not sure if you could treat them fast enough. They had a big mouthful, you see them going down. You'd have to be right there with your IV to correct them. And of course, it all depends on how much and, what else is in the room. But, that's very quickly, whereas a nitrate poisoning would be slower over a course of several hours.
But again, both conditions can be quite lethal to cattle, so management is key here. And there is a series of things that producers can do to minimize the potential of these kinds of toxicity. It starts with knowing what you have out there, right, Sandy?
Yes, and I was just had some note from my insurance this morning. I haven't used my vehicle insurance for a long time, and I'm so glad of that. Well, I want people to think about testing their forages as a really cheap insurance policy before you feed it to your livestock. And now, I used to say that probably I wouldn't test for prussic acid on a routine basis, particularly in hay, but I guess as I'm doing more work in prussic acid and knowing some other things that have occurred, that I don't think we should assume that prussic acid is not going to be in dry hay. So I guess I've always preached we need to test our baled forages for nitrates, and I encourage you to also test those for prussic acid. If it was high before it was baled, I think it's going to stay high. And the frequency of that with prussic acid isn't very high, but just talk to the guy that lost 7 cows from this one bale of feed, and, that's the trade-off. It can be just devastating if it's in there and you feed it.
There are, two perceptions here, Sandy, that letting that forage dry out will alleviate these concerns, or ensiling the hay product, the forage product, as opposed to putting it up for hay or allowing it to be grazed. In either case, do those procedures provide relief here?
Yeah, if we ensil it, it does seem to reduce both nitrates and prussic acid. So, yes, you can use it that way if silage is a option for you. Mm-hmm. But what's in the hay when it dries seems to be there, and I wouldn't assume that it's going to leave. The prussic acid will leave when it dries out.
Back, though, to the primary step here, and that is sampling that forage, whether it's standing forage, whether it's baled. The procedure for sampling should be thorough in either case, right?
Right. We know that these things can be variable across the field. What you don't want to do is grab a handful out of a windrow, stick that in a bag, and send it off, all right? Well, you can do it, but I wouldn't trust that for a good representation of the entire field. Now, I think it's easier to sample in the bale. You can get a good core sample across all aspects of that bale, and we want to do 10 to 15% or more of those bales. Probably the more you can make yourself do, the better, and mix that up well and subsample it. And we can certainly help you with that sampling process because it's very important to get a representative sample. There might be situations where you want to sample some bales separately based on growth conditions in a field if you can identify those bales. And then if we're going to look at a forage we want to graze, Then, you're going to sample the portion of the plant you expect those animals to graze. One way to do that is kind of take off on a diagonal across the field, sample every 50 to 100 yards, depending on, how big is the field, and collect, again, that portion of the plant you expect them to graze. The more of those that you can collect, if you're looking at a fairly tall plant, you might have enough sample with one or two plants, but one or two plants representing everything that's out there, that's the challenge. So you want to take as many of those as you can force yourself to do, chop them up, mix them up. If you're doing that a bucket or something else, then you want to pour that out and essentially talk about a quartering method, subsample that, because if you just try to grab a handful, the leaves may stay in your hands more easily than the stalk, and it would be hard to do. So you probably need some method of some subsampling. Now, the feed test labs generally, if you send larger plants and larger volumes, they'll grind that up, but you kind of got to get it into a package you can send it in unless you're going to drive it directly.
As you say, local extension agricultural agents can lend further advice on sampling procedure. Do have a look as well at an article that Sandy put together on this very subject, testing to prevent nitrate and prussic acid poisoning in cattle herds. It's in the Beef Tips newsletter for this month of September at ksubeef.org. Very timely word, Sandy, as we're moving into fall now. Thank you for taking a few moments and covering this with us today.
You bet. Glad to be here.
She is Beef Systems Specialist Sandy Johnson of K-State Research and Extension on this opening part of Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now as we're chatting once more with Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. He joins us every other Wednesday right here. Roger, we're going to cover a single court case today, but it's involved, as you'll explain, and it revolves around the effort to protect, in this case, farm assets from creditors, and what happens when that goes awry, to be perfectly frank. But this is something that interests producers in as far as creating some sort of mechanism to shield them from creditor pressure, if you will.
Yes, it's a very important topic for a lot of producers, Eric. There are numerous things that a producer can get themselves into that can create liability issues. And I often mention this at conferences I do, that farmers tend to be very good at marketing. They tend to be very good at handling insects and all types of pests. And that's good. And that's all very good. That can all help the bottom line. But you get one case against you on a liability claim that can wipe out your entire operation. Yeah. So we're not talking about missing an uptick in a market or having pest damage or dealing with a crop insurance issue that can harm you with respect to a crop, or not properly structuring yourself for federal farm program payment limitations. We're talking about a liability issue that can destroy the entire farming operation, not just for the current generation, but for subsequent generations also. So this is really, really important stuff to a lot of farmers.
And legally, one can structure their assets and their ownership of assets, and that can provide some protection. That has to be done in the correct fashion. Let's speak to this case recently out of the state of Iowa, where things were not handled in an appropriate way. What were the facts? And by the way, this is very intertwined. You have 3 lawsuits at work at once here, basically.
Yeah, this is an absolute mess. It started at the state level, ends up in federal court. The plaintiff was injured in an automobile accident. She's left in need of 24-hour care, and most certainly for the rest of her life. The accident occurred at a rural intersection, and the defendant admitted fault. And due to his experience as a part-time insurance agent, he knew he would face a large claim for her injuries. And so he tells his family members that he feared losing the family farm that he owned as a result of the impending lawsuit that was sure to come. And so after he determined his liability exposure, he determined that that exposure exceeded his insurance coverage, and so he seeks out legal counsel to help him protect his assets from a potential claim. So he goes to the first attorney, and he has a revocable trust created. He makes several cash transfers to family members exceeding $100,000. He's trying to shield assets by shedding himself of ownership. Although a revocable trust doesn't do that, that's improper, and you can't make cash gifts like that to family members. So that was really bad advice that he got. He notified the bank, his bank, that he'd recently been found at fault in a major vehicle auto accident. In fact, he admitted fault, and that he was going to face liability exposure in excess of his insurance coverage. But in spite of that, the bank began working with him to weaken the appearance of his financial condition. Well, he leaves that attorney, he goes to another attorney, and the other attorney tells him, well, the first advice you got was bad, and this is an attorney that specializes in asset protection. And he tells him, well, we need to put the farmland into an LLC. You need to execute a quitclaim deed to transfer that in there so that it's protected from your anticipated personal injury judgment. That deed's accompanied by a trustee's affidavit. The attorney prepared it, notarized it, stating the trust was conveying the real estate free and clear of any adverse claims. So he's moving the real estate out of the trust that the first attorney created into an LLC. And that was done about a month before trial occurred in the personal injury case. Well, the state court comes in on this, ultimately awards the lady that was injured about $2.6 million in damages for personal injury, gets into the second lawsuit, and finally the third lawsuit after it gets removed to federal court, because there's a RICO claim that ultimately gets filed in this. See, the parties tried to settle. The award was $2.57 million. They moved towards settlement negotiations on that instead of litigating that. Well, that broke down, which led to the third case, and then claim for personal liability and the RICO claim. That gets into federal court. Well, you get a racketeering charge wrapped into this, which you can if you do asset protection improperly. That's brought against the attorney that created the LLC, and fraudulent conveyance under state law. So you have a state law claim, you have a federal claim, and RICO has both civil and criminal penalties into it. And if you're deemed to have violated the RICO statute willfully, you go to prison for about 20 years on that. So this is serious stuff. You've got to do asset protection planning correctly.
Well, this almost reads like a Hollywood screenplay. It's so involved, Roger, and so much at stake here. What was done wrong here largely had to do with trying to make this retroactive to this liability claim. What was the lesson learned here? Well, timing is everything when it comes down to asset protection. We can do asset protection for clients, and that's a large part of entity structuring, and it's not unlike tax planning. You're not obligated to pay more in taxes than you have to. You can structure your affairs to minimize taxes. Tax avoidance is not the same as tax evasion. But then the question comes up as to, well, where's the appropriate line between what is an acceptable tax avoidance strategy, income tax planning, or estate tax planning, to something that's impermissible and turns into tax evasion? It's comparable here. What is appropriate in terms of asset protection? What's not appropriate? Well, a key point to keep in mind for those that are producers as well as practitioners is you have to start this process early, before there's any potential claim against you or after a claim has been filed against you. If you start the asset protection process early by creating, in this instance, an LLC before there's been an accident, you're fine. If you transfer assets away from you, you're fine, as long as there's no pending claim or threat of a pending claim that's out there. That's appropriate planning. You're structuring your affairs for the future to protect your assets for subsequent generation. Now, that's what the individual here that admitted fault in the accident claimed he was doing. He told the attorney, the second attorney, I want to preserve the farm for my son. Well, yeah, you want to preserve the farm for your son, but you're also trying to shield it from an anticipated creditor.
And so from an attorney standpoint, what we have to do in these situations is thoroughly vet the client. Mm-hmm. Why is that client in my office asking me to do what the client is asking me to do? Interview the client, do background checks on the client, turn up any type of potential judgments or cases that have been filed that are out there. Provide a detailed questionnaire for the client to go through. Make sure you're familiar with all of the assets, all of the liabilities, and then have a well-drafted engagement letter that explains the perils in doing asset protection, and that if you haven't told me something you needed to tell me, then the problem's on you. I'm drafting this letter to protect myself from claims in the event that something goes wrong, like it went horribly wrong in this situation. So planning early and then thoroughly understanding your client's situation and getting all of the facts before you engage in this type of planning.
That's for the practitioner side, but once more, just to remind our producers out there, there are legitimate mechanisms for protecting your assets and, in fact, transferring to family members if that's something of interest to the farmer or rancher here, as long as it's constructed the right way.
That's exactly right. And again, we see this in all of tax planning, or much of tax planning, whether that's income tax, estate tax. We see this with respect to what we call Medicaid planning or elder law, trying to shield assets, protect them for the family from being drawn down to pay a long-term care health bill in a nursing home. There's a right way to do that. There's an incorrect way to do that. And that's the same thing here. Yeah. So we always want to organize our affairs to protect our assets for family members. We just have to do it correctly. But when you get this late in the ball game, there needs to be a big stop sign that goes up with a complete explanation of, if you go through that stop sign, here are the consequences that can follow from a legal standpoint. And that's what happened in this case. And I'll tell you, the federal district court judge's opinion in this case has some very, very sharp and harsh language for the attorney involved that created the LLC. You never want to see that as a practitioner. And even in this instance, for the individual involved, he's got problems for fraudulent conveyances. So if you're doing some things on your own, such as with the bank and those cash transfers, those are bad things too. So we have to be careful to do things correctly.
As you might imagine, Roger has put together a great read on this in his blog series. This was posted on September the 20th, just last week. Estate planning to protect assets from creditors, dancing on the line between legitimacy and fraud. Find it at his blog site, washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. Roger, as always, thanks for going over this with us.
Thank you, Eric.
He's a professor of agricultural law and taxation, Washburn University School of Law, and a regular guest here on the broadcast. Roger McEowen, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome back to Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you, and on to today's agricultural news headlines now, courtesy in part of DTN, and we start by reporting that we received word yesterday of another K-State livestock legend having left us. Bob Hines passed away on Saturday in Indiana, where he had recently moved. The family will have a private graveside service in Sheridan. Bob was 85 years old. He earned his bachelor's degree in animal husbandry from Purdue University back in 1957. At that time, he was a member of the 1956 Purdue livestock judging team, where he was named the high individual at the Chicago International Livestock Exposition Judging Contest. Bob earned his master's and doctorate degrees in swine nutrition and management from Michigan State University. He served as Michigan's State Swine Extension Specialist for 3 years, at the same time coaching the Michigan State livestock judging team there. In 1966, after finishing his Ph.D., Bob joined the faculty of Kansas State University's Department of Animal Sciences and Industry, where he taught until his retirement in 2000. Bob judged at the local, state, and national levels, as many know, for 45 years. Memorials may be directed to either the Purdue Livestock Judging Team in West Lafayette, Indiana, or the K-State Livestock Judging Team, Bob Hines Memorial, and toward the latter, you can contact Dave Nichols here at K-State in the Animal Sciences and Industry Department. Go online to asi.ksu.edu for more. But again, Doc Hines, Bob Hines, passing away Saturday at the age of 85. Congressional action around the continuing resolution to fund the government, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the budget reconciliation bill, as well as the debt limit, all appear to be coming into focus as the government's fiscal year ends at midnight on Thursday. All of these issues with implications for agriculture. If the government shuts down, USDA offices in Washington and around the country would have to close. Federal payments to producers due for release in early October would be put on hold until a funding mechanism is passed that would allow those funds to be released. Now, in the past, special provisions were also needed to ensure that food aid recipients continued to receive aid through the SNAP program. If the government's ability to issue debt is not increased, it could affect government payments to producers. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen telling Congress on Tuesday that the federal government will run out of money to pay its bills on October the 18th. If the federal government is forced to shut down, it would be the third time in 8 years. The government shut down for 16 days back in 2013 in the battle over the Affordable Care Act, and it shut down for a record 35 days from December of 18 to January of 19 in that dispute over the funding for a wall on the southern border. The National Pork Producers Council and the American Farm Bureau Federation have now petitioned the Supreme Court to consider their challenge to California's Proposition 12, which would ban the sale of pork from hogs that don't meet that state's new production standards. The group's petition come on the heels of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit's July ruling that upheld July of last year, that is. That upheld a lower court ruling against the groups. The groups had asked the Ninth Circuit for an injunction to stop the law from taking effect. That law forbids the sale of whole pork meat in California from hogs born of sows not housed in conformity with the law. Proposition 12 forbids sows from being confined in such a way that they cannot lie down, stand up, fully extend their limbs, or turn around without touching the sides of their stalls or other animals. Now, the Commerce Clause grants Congress power to regulate trade among states. It restricts states from regulating commerce outside of their borders, except for matters related to public health and safety. In July, the Ninth Circuit said in its ruling that though Proposition 12 would have a dramatic upstream effect and require pervasive changes to the pork industry nationwide, in the court's words, it still ruled it would not allow the agricultural group's case to continue. As of January 2022, Proposition 12 will prohibit the sale of pork not produced according to California's production standards. Now, in a news release, the agricultural group said in order for farmers to continue selling pork to the 40 million consumers in California, about 15% of the U.S. pork market, by the way, pork producers would need to switch to alternative sow housing systems, which require billions of dollars in conversions or building new barns. And they added with consumers bearing the ultimate cost through higher pork prices. A recent Kansas State University study looked at the carbon credit market and whether it's an opportunity for producers to earn extra income. Scarlett Hagens tells us here there is potential, but there are a few things that producers should think about before entering into a carbon credit contract.
Carbon credits refer to a tradable permit or certificate that offsets the emission of 1 ton of carbon dioxide or another greenhouse gas by the credit holder. Large corporations like McDonald's and Microsoft recently have announced voluntary efforts to reduce carbon emissions by contributing to a carbon credit market. Agriculture is one of several industries that could benefit from the offset sought by corporations. In effect, a farmer could be paid for implementing practices on their land that reduce carbon emissions, like no-till or planting cover crops. Practices such as these and others sequester carbon from the air and store it in the soil. This helps offset carbon emissions from the corporations buying the credits. The The K-State study was geared toward helping farmers better understand how to enter the carbon market and what factors should be considered before signing a contract. A few of those factors include determining the length of the commitment, what the tenant-landlord relationship would be, the type of data the farmer would be required to provide, and how that data would be used by the buyer. The research was presented at the recent K-State Risk and Profit Conference in Manhattan. The full presentation can be viewed by going to the events section on agmanager.info and clicking on Risk and Profit Conference. I'm Scarlett Hagans.
And do want to let you know about a calendar item coming up in the month of October. A professor at the University of California, Davis, who has spent nearly 2 decades studying the relationship between the livestock industry and air quality, will be the featured speaker for the Henry C. Gardner Global Food Systems Lecture, October the 11th, here at K-State. Frank Metlaner will present Rethinking Methane, Animal Agriculture's Path to Climate Neutrality, 7 o'clock the evening of the 11th in McCain Auditorium. Admission is free. If you'd like to learn more about this lecture, how to attend, you can go to the K-State College of Agriculture website. You're listening to Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
Every night I walked the aisle and listened to the horses munching hay.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
It's 2 weeks ago tomorrow we were off to Pinehurst, Texas. The smartphone said it would be a 10-hour and 20-minute drive. However, that is without stopping or any road work. We quickly calculated it would take us 12 hours. No problem with 2 drivers. Talina, my daughter, was the second driver. I had collected all of Martine's old horse stuff, bridles, halters, blankets, halter ropes, and my saddle. It's a good Western saddle. To miss the road construction, I chose to drive 77 south. It is a very good road. As we left fairly early, the rising sun was to our left, and at one time a small car was in front of us, slightly weaving off the road. It held its course and was able to climb back on the solid pavement. Not funny to watch. One reason why you should keep distance, and of course, the reason not to text or use a phone while driving. After a few miles, the car turned off to the right and we passed it. A youngster driving and on the phone. Near El Dorado, we picked up Interstate 35 going south. We quickly slipped into Oklahoma, going for Texas. Once we hit the Texas border, we made another quick stop at the Welcome to Texas stop. It lays in a gentle left curve going south. I like to stop there because of the bronze. It's a statue of an advancing soldier depicting the landing at Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. I walk to it and look at it for a while, thinking and saying, thank you to all. After a short rest, we went on our way. There was road construction and slowdowns. One slowdown and a long stop was caused by a bad accident. It was like Talina said, if the car which had 2 wheels off the road earlier that morning had rolled and flipped over, we would have stopped and attended. Doing that comes natural, but it quickly delays a trip a couple of hours. I'm glad it did not happen. I know the kid behind the wheel, to him it meant nothing. Probably laughed, because when he turned off he was still talking on the phone. The accident which did delay us was on the interstate at a construction site with slowdowns. When we finally slowly passed the accident and looked, I was not driving, I saw a small car, totally to its rear window shoved under a semi-trailer. No one could have survived that accident. When driving, do not be distracted. For those who slowly passed, life goes on. It's a hard fact. It could be a lesson. Do not text or use a phone while driving. Keep your distance. Keep your eyes on the road. As I put these thoughts on paper, Martine is driving a long day from Pinehurst to the Try-and Show grounds near Asheville, North Carolina. He is a good driver. The horses went earlier this time, shipped by commercial horse transport. It will be a 3-week horse show. This was the first time they left from their own base, Marlack Farm, which opened up in early August. It was the reason for us to go and see them, what was built up since construction started. I'm impressed. What was once a hay meadow has been built up with the perfect soil dug from a new pond on the property. The stables are up. Horses have their stalls. Every night while there, I walked the aisle and listened to the horses munching hay or just snorting. I took a photo of a softly lit up stalls, all quiet and content, with the full moon rising above the new building. Very peaceful. 26 stalls, nearly all filled, and more horses coming. A huge grassy arena to ride, the training arena to be built soon. They're working on the right best footing for the jumpers. On their property, the big native oaks have Spanish moss, swaying in the breeze. It is different, especially by moonlight. Years ago, friends left me a wooden goose cut out. It's life-size and two-dimensional. I had an idea and fitted it in the back of the RAV. It was one of these first things I unpacked and carefully placed on the edge of the holding pond next to the entrance gate. I placed it so that it looked as natural as possible. A white goose walking into the water to take its swim. I knew it was a success when Carly, the Pyrenees, started barking at it, as it was to him an intruder. When the barn was newly opened, there was a small gathering of friends who had shared with Martine's dream, their own Marlack Farm. We were not there, but in true tradition, we bought a 14 feet or more quality bur oak, and it was planted between the barn and the yet-to-build walker. For a man who starts bur oaks by planting an acorn, this was quite a rush. Walking the nursery row with many good trees was fun. Daniela selected the tree, and that's the one now growing near the barn. Years earlier, I had started seedlings from the London plane tree here near the house. Those were seedlings brought along in an earlier trip. They are now trees with just enough shade to sit under. Trees, Kansas trees, in Texas, doing well.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That's our time for today. Thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.